Hi, welcome everybody. This is a chat between myself, I'm Dave Camlin, and Catherine Zesserson and Helena Daff, and we recently wrote and had published a paper entitled Group Singing as a Resource for the Development of Healthy Public. And we thought it might be useful and helpful to have a little chat about that paper as a way of introducing it to you. So if you're interested, this is a good starting place to find out a little bit more about it. And then there's a link in the chat below that will take you directly to the article if you want to follow it up. So I'd like to introduce my good friend and colleague, Catherine Zesserson. We thought this might be a nice way to do it, to organise this as a chat. And Catherine has very kindly agreed to mediate that conversation. So Catherine, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a real joy and a pleasure. And so I, of course, the writing of such an article takes a long time and one loses perspective on the thread. So it was a real pleasure to come back to the work that Dave, you and Helena led with such care and rigor. And my role in that was as a kind of reader and a supporter and a kind of critical mirror and reflector. So coming back to the article, I was really struck by its potential value, its practical utility, I suppose, for those of us who are working in the fields of both group singing and healthy publics. And so I wanted to stimulate this conversation by putting two or three perspectives to you and inviting you both to then comment on how can we take hold of this article and really use it to advance those things that we all care so deeply about. So I guess the first thing that struck me from my practitioner perspective is what great value you've given me as a practitioner in providing both a language base and a scaffold that enables me to talk about the practice of group singing to people who come from a different discipline or a different perspective. So the offering of the scientific and theoretical framework connected with the experiential and the phenomenological feels to me of great value to me as a practitioner, to us as practitioners. So one of the things I'm really interested in hearing about is how we might use that and take that forward. Of course, then the other side of the story is that for people coming from an academic, scientific, and theoretical perspective who maybe don't have lived experience, either as participants or as facilitators of group singing, you've given us a really beautiful window into that world and what it feels like, the meaning in the worldness of group singing and the experience of it. And so I'm imagining that if that was the world from which I came, it would be a very enticing window that you've opened for me, a way of stepping into a balance between a theoretical understanding of human experience and a lived understanding of human experience in that context of group singing. So looking at how those two perspectives might hybridize, might come together to give us something to support us to go forward, I'd love to hear from each of you, how can we as a community of practice, which I now understand is something that incorporates both practitioners and researchers, so brackets, thanks for doing that job, because that's super helpful. How can we as a community of practice take this work and have it help us to drive forward in our mission? Dave, perhaps you could kick off.
Great, that's a good provocative start, Catherine. Thank you. I mean, for me, actually, the first thing to say is all of this came out of working together. I kind of me and Helena met, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 years ago, with similar interests, but coming at the thing that we're both interested in from quite different perspectives as well. And it's been really, and this felt like it's the culmination of a lot of kind of thinking. It feels like we've each challenged each other's thinking along the way around what we're interested in. There's a scientist's joke that runs: the plural of story is not data, and that's and I think but in terms of group singing, one of the things that's always kind of frustrating is that when you ask people about their experiences of group singing, invariably, and this comes out in the literature, people resort to the language of magic because it goes beyond words to explain it. So some of the things we're saying in the article is part of the thing that underpins group singing might be pre-linguistic, and actually that's what some of what's going on is that the experience is so profound and there are so many different things that are involved that people lose the capacity to speak about it in words. It's the actual act of doing it. So I think from a practitioner's point of view, that's really useful. But actually, those stories that people routinely say about why they value group singing, the transcendental moments, the spiritual dimensions about it, that those are actually really useful stories. They're not. We don't dismiss them as being fluff, but we actually they become an essential part of our understanding in what is going on with group singing. And on their own, they're insufficient. We need to look behind that to understand actually what is going on. Why do people continue to talk about this particular experience in this way? What can a scientific understanding bring to that? So we used this methodology that was about collecting people's stories, but then we were also testing out some of these ideas around the complexity of what's involved and theorising around what this complexity might be. I mean, I don't know, Helen, do you want to say any more about that?
I agree with you entirely, Dave. I think it's for me, because I came from, I tend to be boxed up as a scientist these days because I'm based in an electronic engineering department. But of course, fundamentally, to me, I'm a musician, and that's where I started out. And I kind of stumbled upon becoming a scientist partly because I've always been so fascinated in what, for me, singing does to me, and especially singing with other people. And why I became so excited when we met and we started to work together was that, I can spend a whole year just looking at acoustic waveforms that singers have created. And I can get very excited by that, and I can get obsessed with synchronization. And scientists will, or certainly in music and music acoustics, it's very hard to measure things. And so we will often latch on to things that are easier to measure. And in terms of singing together and where the experiential value is in that, it's quite easy, or it's a common methodology to measure the social aspect or the well-being aspect. We can say this person has self-reported that they feel a bit better about their life and they are singing, and therefore, causation, correlation can be associated. When you want to look at very specific things, we tend to then start to forget about that, potentially, or focus on one or the other. So I might look at how people sing together in terms of their onsets and synchronization or harmony or tuning together. So I can measure how they've tuned, how well they've tuned. But there's a big gap between that and this experience that's felt. And so this paper I think is exciting because it starts to bridge that gap. It starts to say, this stuff is really hard to measure. It's so hard to measure, we can't even talk about it. We can't express what we are trying to measure. But that doesn't mean, therefore, researchers shouldn't try. So it's, to me, that's why this is a really exciting paper, because it paves the way for us to start to ask the difficult questions, which says that there's something about the process of singing together, and it's beyond the fact that we're meeting even on a mountainside to have a conversation. There's something that's taking place in that process, and we don't know what it is yet. And that's a fabulous question, isn't it?
It really is. It's a marvelous question, and I'm reminded of my very earliest years as a practitioner back in the kind of late 70s and early 80s, when we were kind of inventing, or at least in the UK anyway, we were kind of feeling our way into creating a community singing movement, a community voice movement. And there was a lot of reaching out to historical and anthropological and sociocultural reference points, ritual practice, spiritual practice, to try and find a way of naming and framing the thing we observed, which is that a lost singing tradition easily reanimates. There's something, we want to do it. There's something shows up and people want to do it. It's not difficult to reanimate lost collective singing traditions. So just to kind of follow up from that, I wanted to just focus in on one phrase, actually, first of all, which is this concept of healthy public, because that may not be so familiar to everyone who's, you know, working in a wider field. And I'm interested in it from two perspectives. I'm interested in, what do you mean by a healthy public? So I guess the subtext is, what's your measure of healthy? And my second question is, by public, do we mean everybody? Because there's a contentious little seed buried in there, which is, wait, maybe this is only good for the people it's good for. So what is healthy and who are the public? Who'd like to kick off?
Gosh, that's a great question. I mean, actually, yeah, there's so many ways to approach that and think about that. I mean, the term healthy public, healthy publics, is something that's emerged out of this new field of health humanities, and it's the idea that actually we can think about health not just from the point of view of addressing some kind of deficit in health, but also that we can think about health in terms of, you know, what we might call eudaimonia, the idea of a life well lived. That actually there are things that people can do that might help them to be healthy, rather than waiting until they get a diagnosis of illness that they then have to recover from. So I think, and that's certainly an important part of it. You know, if you want to think about what kind of things can people do that will improve their health before it becomes something that's pathologized, then group singing, we're suggesting in this article, is one of those things, and it is one of those things for a number of reasons. As you know, as Helen has said, there might be, I mean, we outline in the article, you know, there are a number of mechanisms at work here that probably lie behind what's going on, and moreover, that all of these mechanisms interconnect with each other, so they adapt to each other, which is part of what makes the measurement of each of them individually more complicated, because actually they change under circumstances, and it probably depends on the song that you're singing, and it probably depends on who you're singing it with, and where you're singing, and why you're singing. All of these things will affect your experience of it. So it's an understanding the complexity of that is then what might lead it to be something that has health-giving properties or health-sustaining properties. I guess within the notion of healthy publics is contained the idea of mutual recovery as well, and we talk about that in more of a medical sense. This is the idea that there are some things that can be done that might be conceived as of benefit to people with a clinical diagnosis that are also beneficial for people who don't have a clinical diagnosis. So group singing might be good for people recovering their mental health. It might also be really good for the people who are looking after them as well. You know, and we know, you know, people that are experiencing Parkinsonism, group singing might be great for all of the people surrounding the people with a diagnosis. So mutual recovery and the idea of health for everybody is a different way of thinking about health.
Helena, I wonder, you know, what are your observations about this question of, is it good for everybody? And
I think it's a really good observation, and I've seen already a few comments from the paper about this, and actually I find that really reassuring, because it's a limitation of, I think, most research, if not all research, that looks at the benefits of group singing, in that it tends to be self-selecting in terms of your sample. So thinking from a scientist's point of view, where am I getting these people from that are taking part in a study? They're people who are willing to take part in a study involved in singing. And so I think it's not been tested yet whether or not someone who is particularly reluctant to sing, and there are a lot of people out there who are very reluctant to sing. So when I talk about my research in public forums, I will invariably have people come up to me afterwards and say, great, you know, really interesting talk, but you'd never get me taking part. And there's, as far as I'm aware, there isn't work yet done on that group of people, which is a significant group of people.
Yeah.
Well, and it's a group of people that I would argue, I would propose, is not static. That is to say,
Absolutely.
the sense of choice about participation and the thing in which we choose or do not choose to participate, I think also intersect. And I would draw from my experience as a practitioner, thinking, you know, back to the days when I might be working in contexts where people's extrinsic choices were limited. So psychiatric day centers or youth programs where young people were kind of mandated to be present. And my experience of bringing singing as something to investigate was pretty much always that the degree to which people didn't want to do it at first had nothing to do with whether they, after a process of time, said it had been beneficial. And liking it isn't necessarily related to whether it has a beneficial impact on us. So, you know, there's some really interesting, I have nephews and nieces who refuse to sing Christmas carols. You know, they would run many miles rather than sing with me. So I think there's a lot to tease out there. Dave, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's two things there actually. Firstly, I think that's absolutely right, and we do highlight it in the paper that what really needs to be researched in future is the experience of non-participation. You know, that I think that's really clear. But the second thing relating to that point of why don't people sing? I mean, we hint at this in the paper. We didn't feel we could really go all the way with it. But one of the things that we're kind of hinting at is that actually, if singing is about the performance of relationship, which is kind of what people are saying it is, you know, in the stories that people told, it's all to do with the sense of connection they feel with other people. So if one of the ways that singing works as a resource for the development of healthy publics is because it gives people a metaphor for relationship. It's a way of being in relationship with other people in a very physical way. You know, if the theory that we're suggesting is true, that actually when we sing together, our neurobiology is becoming entangled with other people through the act of singing, through these acts of entrainment, then there are big implications for that. So I think, you know, some of the reasons that people might find this profoundly spiritual is because they have the sense that they're, you know, one of the respondents in the survey said, I had a sense of my precious sense of self disappearing on a wave of harmony. I think it's that experience of actually when you're losing yourself, you're giving yourself up to a collective experience that is transcendental. And actually, if that feels comfortable, then it's really powerful. But you only need to think, actually, if you're coming from a background of trauma, say, and your experience of intimacy with other people where that, you know, that at a neurobiological level that doesn't feel safe, then actually opening yourself to that kind of level of neurobiological intimacy in a public setting can feel, I imagine, could feel really overwhelming as well. So part of the thing that may make group singing its most potent might also be the thing that is almost like an act of symbolic violence against the people who feel that they can't do it because it would be too upsetting or too overwhelming somehow for them. So I think it raises a whole load of complex challenges and issues.
Helena, from a kind of research design perspective, you know, the complexity of studying those who are absent, you know, it's by its nature a pretty challenging methodological proposition. So if you had, you know, all the resources and time in the world and you wanted to design the next study, just what are your first thoughts about how you guys might go about digging in, or anybody else watching and listening who'd like to join in the thinking process? How might we go about getting inside understanding this broader population in relation to group singing?
For me, I think it's where you need a really, really big study that involved different types of music making. So then you can challenge these concepts of entrainment, etc., under different musical situations. So we haven't touched yet on the fact that we're talking about singing, but can you get these things from other musical activities? Singing is very easy to justify as our point of contact because it's an accessible musical art form, you know, and it's our instrument, which potentially makes it more potent, but we don't know that, you know, that's not been tested. So it would be a study that involved music making in different ways, and it would need to take a long time. So something that we're very rarely given the freedom or money, more importantly, to do is longitudinal studies. I think if you want to look at this non-participatory aspect, then you need to design a study that takes into account the human, because that's absolutely at the forefront, and it would involve a long time of building trust. So it would need to have practitioners at the heart of it, running it, being there and doing it, and it would need the research design to fit around what would need to happen practically on a musical level, working with excellent professionals who can build a level of trust to see whether, you know, you can through music making, through singing together, build up a level of trust and find safety within that experience. So it would, I don't know is the simple answer. It would take a lot of thinking through, but time and putting practice at the heart of it, like, to me, is what would be important.
The other thing that occurs to me is we can, and I think that that's absolutely right, that like the complete non-participation, people who don't get near the threshold, really, you know, that's really important to understand. There is probably some work that we can do by looking at threshold experiences of group singing, of actually understanding from the experiences of people who may come to a taster session for a group singing and then don't go again. Who may be more accessible to us as a population, of understanding what those experiences are like.
So coming into the final chapter of this conversation, then I'm going to invite each of you to, in a moment, give your answer to the question, what would you now love to happen as a result of having published this paper? And just to give you a moment to gather your thoughts, to consider what your answer to that question might be. I just wanted also to note that this idea of participation in group singing, because of its antiquity, because of its ubiquity in human life, strikes me also that there might be an interesting piece of work to do, which is really cross-disciplinary, which steps out into anthropology, which steps out into beyond music psychology and music philosophy, and encapsulates and encodes in it also some of the historical, spiritual, and anthropological stories. So to review older stories through the lenses of the more scientific and technical resources available to us might also add a really kind of interesting frame of reference for your study. Okay, I've temporized long enough. So, Dave, what would you love to have happen as a result of having published this paper?
I mean, for me, there's something to do with understanding what value group singing might have for us in this moment. So that's what I'm most interested in. In this period in human history, what is the potential value of group singing? And that's with the recognition that this capacity that humans have to form social attachments over groups. If you believe, Robin Dunbar's number, 150 people is the physical limit of what we can achieve in terms of intimate relationships as human beings because of the size of our brains. But group singing has been one of the vehicles that has helped us at every evolutionary stage of our development. Firstly, to move into that capacity, and also to find ways of moving beyond it. So, if you in evolutionary biological terms, you can look at every stage of human evolution. Jared Diamond characterises it, the movement from bands to tribes to chiefdoms to nation states. And then every point of that evolutionary journey, we can see how music in general and group singing has been implicated in how we've made that transition. So even in just the transition from the people that you can immediately form a bond of attachment with, of intimate attachment with, as your small family band, to thinking of yourselves as a group of 150. That's what singing might do. The move into chiefdoms, when we start developing cultural references that people can identify things that might mark us out as friend or foe or part of the same thing, has helped to move into that state. And clearly the move into the nation state, music is an absolutely core part of how a nation identifies itself. So if our developmental challenge as a species now, in this moment in time, certainly for the next 30 years, is how do we develop more sustainably on the planet to become a global species and get beyond the constraints of thinking of ourselves in terms of nation states? How do we evolve into that kind of identity? Those are the questions that concern me. How can music help with this next stage of our evolutionary development, and what role can group singing play here? And for me, the things that we're highlighting in this study are to do with love, to do with attachment. If the thing that's going to help us to become a more sustainable species on the planet is being able to feel felt by people that do not necessarily resemble us in terms of our current immediate environment, then there's a promise in there. There's a potential that group singing can create, to use a Bourdieusian idea, an interstice, a crack in the current reality, where we can imagine a kind of society that we might actually want to live in, not the one that we currently reside in. So that's my hope, is that where we look next is understanding how can music generally, and in particular, how can group singing help us in this difficult transition into the next stage of our evolution as a species.
Lovely, and very touching, moving, and inspiring. Helena, what's your dream? What would you love to have happen as a result of having published this paper? What would you love us to do next?
Well, it's interesting when you said that. I went to more kind of practical, immediate things.
That's what I'm working with.
There's two things that I'd like to say, and I'm going to swap them round because of Dave's fabulous and articulate kind of exposition. There was a fabulous way of summing up the bigger picture of where you want this work to go, and it highlights one of the things I want to happen next is that Dave and I continue to work together, because he pointed out earlier on that we challenge each other, and we do and I think it's in a way that is going to change the landscape of the way this research takes place, because while we both, I think, feel the same way in terms of we've had the same personal experiences of singing and singing with people and music in general, but the research camps that we're coming from are often polar opposites, and I think that's really good, and I think that's really good practice. And I really hope that this paper is just the beginning of us starting to forge a new landscape for where this research needs to go, for us to understanding singing as this concept of healthy public, or within this kind of framework of what it is doing to us singing together. So that's one of the things I want to come from this. But in terms of what we found in the paper and the people I want to read it, for me, where I work a lot in virtual reality environments and creating virtual reality singing, which at the moment in the current COVID-19 pandemic that we're in is highly relevant. But actually I was working on that far before the pandemic happened, because of this point of access to group singing. And I think that the paper highlights that this should be a priority for our society, not just when there's a pandemic that means that choirs can't suddenly rehearse together, but because there are always situations where people cannot take part in that group singing activity. And for me, there is so the project that we did after the Hills, the fellowship project that this paper talks about, we took our virtual reality choir into residential homes, and those sorts of accessibility projects will be far more on people's radars now. And I think that's what this paper does, is it highlights the importance that it's not just about having something for people to do who can't get out to go to a choir. You need to find that social interaction. No, we need to find a way that people can sing together, and that's what I want to happen.
And actually, can I just say there's a really interesting tension as well to explore now that we're in this situation. It's always been there when we've been talking about singing in virtual reality, when we in terms of can we get the same benefits from group singing when we're socially isolated, when we're not sharing the same physical space with other human bodies. Is the presence of the human body an essential element that underpins the well-being effects of group singing? And that to me is like that. I've no idea. Well, I've got a hunch. Obviously, you know what you'd like to be true. You believe that it's an essentially human thing. But so the question of how far can virtual experiences replicate this so that people can get these same sense of transcendence and uplift and connection and relationship from them, really fascinating, really exciting.
And just to respond briefly to that before wrapping up, I also have a hunch about that, which is that it might be interesting to ask the question, rather than are we able to get the same benefits, but what benefits are we able to get? Because my hunch is there's a whole lot of different benefits that may be becoming available to people through discovering the experience of virtual singing that were not available to them and are not available to them in the group space. So rather than are we getting the same benefits, maybe what benefits are available, and then investigating the alignment of those.
That could also come back to the non-participatory element.
Exactly. The non-participatory group, and also the non-participatory component within all of us who also participate, because that was my other point, is I don't think it's an on-off thing. As a singer, as a facilitator, as a practitioner, I myself experience resistance to participation on a regular and daily basis because I'm a complex soul like all the rest of us. So I'm going to make a stop now, though, because the object of this discussion has been to open up the richness of the thinking that you've both been driving forward to other people. So whoever's watching and listening to this, whether you're a singer, a practitioner, a researcher, a scientist, whether you love or hate singing, our hope is that you're stimulated through hearing and watching this video and hopefully reading the paper to want to get stuck into extending the conversation. So thank you both very much for talking, and all of you for watching and listening.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks, Catherine.